There's so much that lives inside of us, and there are times when what is inside feels like too much to carry. And as the weight is heavy and the clouds surround, our hearts are looking for a light in the dark.
Good morning. If you don't know me, I'm Pastor Brad, and I am excited that you're joining with us today in the building or online. Thanks for being a part of what's going on. Thanks for taking the time to be here. We're trying to shine light into dark places, and that's what Jesus does. We've been looking into this area of mental health, something that maybe the church hasn't done a great job of addressing in years gone by, but hopefully this has begun changing some of your perspective. We started with our first week with the idea that the darkness is real. This isn't a made-up thing. It's not just this little side thing. It's something that all of us deal with. And what my suggestion was is that there's not mental health and mental unhealth, but we're on a spectrum. And for all of us, we all have different places that are darker than others. We all have dark corners to our insides that we have to be willing to examine. We have to try to shine some light into that. And then we said that the only way to dispel the darkness is to let the light in. We talked about the fact that Jesus is the light, that God knows the light. He is the light, and he knows the darkness. He knows the dark places so he can shine his light in. That's how we dispel the darkness ultimately, is by letting the light of God in and letting the light of his people, of the created order that he's made us let in, because darkness wants to isolate us. Then we talked about anxiety and depression being driven mainly by fear and anger. That these are two of the most commonly wrestled with issues when it comes to mental health. And whereas we might think it's just being sad or a little worried, that it actually has roots in real fear and real anger, and that we have to, again, try to shine some lights on those. And then last week, we had our Fun Day in the Park event, which if you didn't hear, we had over 200 people connect in with. It was a really fun time. I had a number of wonderful conversations with people from our community, and people felt blessed by it. So thank you, church family, for being part of that. But we did provide an online gathering option, to kind of continue the discussion. And we tackled this idea in that discussion. That was to shine light into deep places. We need to both know those deep places, and then we need to protect them. And by protecting doesn't mean just leave them the way they are. It's actually make sure they're okay. So if there's unhealth in the deep places of us, that we have to do something about that. We have to dig deep. If you know the Shrek reference, ogres are like onions, right? Not like parfaits, but like onions. There's lots of layers, but the deeper in you get, that's where you see the fundamental change. We can't just do surface stuff. And unfortunately, if we're gonna be honest, if you're a churchy person, somebody who's been around church for a while, you know that we can be very surfacey sometimes. Well, someone will share this tragic event and we'll go, oh, well, God bless you. I'll pray for you. And then we even forget to pray for them, right? We don't actually meet people in the real dark places. We don't go deep sometimes because sometimes we're not sure of what that means. We're going to look at that specifically today. We're going to really go to one of the deep places. And I want to start by saying, first of all, that again, we're grateful to the Grace Church in Norton, Ohio, and Pastor Dan Gregory. He helped outline a lot of this in a series he did a couple years ago. But I also want to say, first of all, that I am not an expert in what I'm about to talk about. I am a fellow traveler on the journey. I've done a lot of research. I've had a lot of training, as it were, but I'm definitely not an expert. I defer to the experts in a lot of what I'm looking at here. And I want you to know that depending where you're at, this could be a hard message. This could unearth some stuff for you. So if you're online and you need to just click pause or walk away, you go ahead and do that. If you're in the room and it gets a little heavy, you need to walk out, that's okay. There's no shame, there's no worry about that. But what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about trauma. We are going to talk about grief and sorrow and the things that have happened in our lives that sometimes bring us to where we are. And honestly, it's really the deep places. Some of what we talked last week about where we're starting to unearth that. Let me give you some facts. This is back from 2019. At that point, at least 61% of men and 51% of women, and this is in the United States, report at least one significant lifetime trauma event. So not just like, I stubbed my toe once, a few years ago, but look, significant lifetime trauma. Well over half of our population. Trauma is the, catch this one shocked me. Trauma is the #1 cause of death for those between 1 years old. Whether it's from the very, very tragic issues of suicide and things like that, up through medical conditions that come as a result of trauma, to like actual physical trauma, things that happen, not illness or old age or those things, but actually when you look at it from a global scale, all the fingers that trauma leads out, it says that it becomes the number fourth, or the fourth highest cause of death when all ages are considered. And catch this one, because we as Americans, we tend to perk our ears up when we start talking about money, right? We're very capitalistic in that. Well, again, these stats are from 2019. $671 billion were spent in the United States on trauma-related care. This is 2 times what we spend on cardiac care and 3 times what we spend on diabetes or cancer related to trauma. Emotional, spiritual, relational, physical, any of those traumas, those traumatic events. And what often comes with trauma is this idea of grief and sorrow, and what do we do with it? Well, I want to give you a quote from theologian N.T. Wright. He says this: grief, what comes with trauma, could almost be defined as the form love takes when the object of love has been removed. It is love embracing an empty space, love kissing thin air, feeling the pain of nothingness. So when we're talking about loss of a loved one, loss of some kind of relationship, loss of a job, loss of a limb, loss of whatever it might be, it is the form love takes when what you once loved somehow is gone now, or it's not the way it's supposed to be. See, grief is deep, and it is kind of like I don't embrace the yin and the yang theory of life, but it's the yin and yang of kind of love and grief. It's the mirror image of it. So let me say this, something I think we all need to hear. I believe, like mental health in general being on a spectrum, I think our experience with trauma is on a spectrum, and I would suggest that my darkness and your darkness is likely connected to a trauma that you need to reveal. By the trauma that you need to let light in on, that I need to let light in on my life. Because we're good at hiding it. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But the interesting thing about this word trauma, it is an English word, but we get it directly from the Greek language. Do you know what the Greek word is where we get the word trauma? This is going to be a tough one. The Greek word is trauma. Okay? It is literally the Greek word trauma, and that means at its base, the root of that word is wound. We see it in Luke, where it's talking about the Good Samaritan. And it says the Good Samaritan came over to the man that had been beaten and thrown in the ditch, and it says that he bound up his wounds. He bound up his traumas. And you see this in a number of places in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament as well. When the Old Testament was translated into Greek for the people of Jesus' day, that the most common way that different wounds and injuries were translated from the Old Testament were with this word trauma in the Greek. And for this reason, some people actually advocate renaming PTSD. Do you know what PTSD means? Post-traumatic stress disorder. There are some who are advocating, not for this reason, but it makes sense, because of what this actually is, what grief and sorrow and trauma do to us. They're actually advocating renaming it post-traumatic stress injury. Recognizing the fact that it's not just kind of this background thing, but it is an actual wound that needs to be healed. Now, let me suggest for you, again, understanding that there's a spectrum here. If we get a better understanding of trauma and what we can do and how we can respond to it, that means that we can better understand and help others who are going through trauma. But at the same time, if I get a better understanding of trauma, I can better understand and help myself when I recognize the trauma in my life. Because what I found often is stuff that we think is going on, we don't even recognize is actually connected to trauma. I have seen incredibly angry people who aren't really angry and aggressive over the situations in their life presently. It's an overflow of an infected wound in their soul. And they don't even know it's wounded. They're not aware of the wound. It's so, we talked about we have to go to those deep places. That's where it's flowing out of. And this idea of woundedness and needing to address it and shine light on it, this is not foreign to Scripture. In fact, you're going to find this all throughout the Bible. But let me give you one example from 2 Corinthians. And this is going to be from chapter 1. This is the Apostle Paul, the most prolific writer of our New Testament books, the newer books in our Bible, who was writing to Christians in the town of Corinth, which was a very secular place. It wasn't a super highly religious, at least from Judaism or Christianity. It was a very, we would call maybe pagan place. But he tells them this in 2 Corinthians 1, starting in verse 8. He says, "For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, or brothers and sisters, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength." Just stop with that phrase. Anybody ever feel that way? Utterly burdened beyond your strength. I've been there. I would suggest on one degree or another, most of us have. And he says, so much so, this utterly burdened beyond our strength, that we despaired of life itself. We would say something to the lines of, or to the likes of, well, it'd just be better off if I were dead. That's what he's saying. Experience that moment of, I feel like there's too much on me. It would be better off if I were not even here. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands if you've ever been there. But knowing what I do about humanity and sin and the brokenness that it brings, my guess is there would be a lot of hands that went up in this room. Then it goes on and says, "Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death, that we were going to be killed. We were going to lose it all. Everything was going to be taken out." And then there's a very interesting phrase, and I think sometimes what comes next has been misinterpreted. It says, "But this was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead." Now, some have taken this to say that yes, God willfully acts to bring affliction and utter burdening to you to make you want him. I reject that. I do not believe that's what this is saying. When you look at the tenses and how these words work together between perfects and present actives and the different ways that this verse itself is constructed in that original Greek language, it's really a looking back as, hey, look what the result of this thing was. I couldn't see it in the moment, but even in light of all this, look at this thing that came out. He's basically saying, hey, at the end of it, I learned I didn't have to rely on myself, but I could rely on God, because God can even raise the dead. And that points back to maybe a story that, if you're around the Bible, around church, you've heard before. This guy was asked to sacrifice his son. And he was willing to do it. He didn't have to, but he was willing to do it and he said, why? Because he knew that God could raise his son from the dead. When you trust in the power of God, when you trust in his ability over all aspects of life, it can breathe courage into the most terrifying of situations. And that's really what Paul is talking about here. He goes on and then says in verse 10, he says, "He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will deliver us again." What has he done? What have they done? They've set their hope on him. Knowing what God has done, his deliverance that he's had, knowing that God will deliver, having that confidence that God will see him through, he says that they set their hope on him. But the interesting part is, the reason that they could trust God, if you look at the verse before, was because they knew that God could raise people from the dead, that God has that power over it. So this deliverance doesn't mean that you will just get saved from every situation if you trust in God. If you believe in God, nothing bad will ever happen. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that there is deliverance even if death comes. There's an assurance that there is more than right now. There's more than right here. There is a future and an eternity that we can trust in because we have a God who is in authority over, who is sovereign over all those things. And then this wonderful piece that he ends it with verse 11. He says, "You also must help us by prayer." And we'll dig into that more with this upcoming series, where we start talking about really the rhythms of the Christian life and what prayer is. But if you ever wondered if prayer makes a difference, Paul himself, who is the author, again, of the majority of our books of our New Testament, who was this amazing apostle, right? Says, you got to help us. And how is that help accomplished? By people praying. Prayer is powerful and effective. And we'll look into that. But that's how we can partner with one another, even in the midst of what Paul was saying here, great afflictions and being burdened even to the point of death. So, trauma is no stranger to people of the faith. Trauma is no stranger to what we find in the pages of Scripture. But when we step back and we look at how we understand trauma today, the Bible recognizes it. The Bible affirms that it happens. So it's going to help us to know a little bit more about it. Now, when you're dealing with trauma, you're dealing with physical things, you're dealing with social things, and you're dealing with emotional things. The traumas can be in any of those areas, but regardless of what area the trauma comes in, it can still have physical, social, and emotional symptoms as well. If I break my leg, it will have physical symptoms. There's a traumatic injury to my leg, but it will also have social and emotional, relational symptoms as well, because it will affect my ability to go places and connect with people and all the. It's a very broad-ranging thing. It doesn't stay in the same area that it started in. And there's actually in this psychological world, there's 3 types of trauma. There's acute. This is an isolated event, like I broke my leg. Okay, that happened, and then you move from that. Chronic is living in an ongoing situation. It'd be like where I actually have a condition called chronic ankle instability. I can tell you guys are all impressed. I am. I remembered it. This was diagnosed for me when I was in high school, and basically the muscle on the outside of my leg, on the outside of each leg, is a little bit too long, which makes my ankle floppy. And so when you have a floppy ankle, do you know what that ankle wants to do? Flop over. Well, when you flop over on it, and then it all of a sudden tightens up, do you know what happens? You sprain it. So I walked through most of my high school days with sprained ankles because, of course, although I had this condition, I made sure I didn't do anything, athletic. I just really sat. No, I played basketball and volleyball. I did all this stuff. So I was chronically injuring my ankle. And so my ankles are way bigger than they should be. There's results of having sprained it time and time again. If you're walking with me now, because the problem is once you do that, you have the muscles that are a little too long and you keep spraining them. Do you know what happens to it? They get longer, which makes your ankle floppier. So now I can be walking down the street, okay? Walking down the street and just fall down, having sprained an ankle. It happens all the time. I was walking in, I took my son to Shady Maple for a special Daddy Sunday. We were literally walking down the sidewalk into Shady Maple and I went down. I didn't trip on anything. I just went down because that's what my ankles do. There's a chronicness to that has ongoing situations or ongoing symptoms. But then there's a third thing as well. And that's what's called complex or developmental trauma, meaning it's not just even a singular ongoing, it's a whole series of different kinds of traumas in different areas that all mound up together. And they're saying that in the population today, roughly 3% of the American population is diagnosed with PTSD, and an additional 3% are now being diagnosed with this complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, if you've got these traumas, whether they're acute and they've gotten better, or chronic, something that's ongoing, or complex, multiple things, most of us, our natural reaction is to do what with our trauma? What would you think? Boom, you literally read my nose. Bury it, hide it. But do you know what that's like? That's like if your family has a dog. Okay, which every family should have a dog. You shouldn't have a cat. We've gone over this before. But if your family has a dog, it's a lovable creature, right? And that creature dies. Okay? And our family's starting to deal with this because we have a little thing that probably shouldn't have lived as long as it already has. Our dog is probably going to die pretty soon. And we're going to have to process that with our kids. But what if instead of your dog dying, you go, I don't want to deal with that. Let's just buy some new carpet. And you carpet over the dead dog. You can't see the dog anymore, right? We don't talk about the dog. Now you've got a big lump in the middle of your family room. And it might smell, and people might look, is there something there? Oh, no, we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it. This is what we do with our trauma. We try to just kind of carpet over it. We try to maybe shuffle it off to the side or bury it under something else because we're not sure how to deal with it. But the thing about trauma is we know it hurts. Trauma isn't trauma if it doesn't hurt. Okay? So what do we do with this? How do we think about it? Well, I think we have to be careful because I mentioned this before. There's the idea of there are things that can trigger trauma or trauma responses, meaning when we have experienced trauma, there are certain things that can remind us and put us right back into that place where we almost re-experience the trauma in an ongoing fashion. And if you really have a significant trauma in your life, whether, again, acute, chronic, or complex, those triggers can be extremely potent. It is not well, you're just being too sensitive. I've heard people say that about people who are being actually triggered. Now, in our world, has this idea of being triggered been taken too far? I would suggest that it has. And I think it offends me when it does, because it actually takes away from the significance of those who are legitimately being triggered in their trauma responses. But the reality is these triggers do happen. That's why at the beginning I said I wanted to give permission. If this is digging up stuff, as we're talking about deep past hurts, if it's too much, you walk out, that's okay. We need to have a compassion with those things. But let me give you a sense of what happens when trauma happens. This is from Hilary LeBeau. She is a kind of a medical journalist, and it was reviewed by some psychiatrists as well. But here's an understanding of what happens with trauma. This is specifically pointing towards complex trauma, but it says when you experience a traumatic event, it activates the limbic system in the brain. This fire alarm shuts down all non-essential systems, rest, digestion, sleep, and floods your body with stress hormones like cortisol so you can prepare for fight, flight, or freeze. There is literal neurochemical brain activity altered by trauma and trauma triggers. The brain is changed when this goes on. For me, understanding how God's wired us, this should move anyone who says, I choose to follow Jesus, to be moved to compassion for someone who's in this, not in some kind of, well, just buck up and deal with it. That is not how Jesus would respond to this. This is literally changing the brain to prepare to deal with the trauma, to deal with the wound that's happening. Fight, flight, or freeze. Now, if you have an acute trauma, or it's just, the minor stressors of the day, she goes on and says, once danger passes, your parasympathetic, look at that, a real big word to impress your friends with, your parasympathetic nervous system provides inner calm, otherwise known as your rest and digest mode. At this point, normal cognitive function returns, and you can go back to your day with relatively few side effects, except only feeling a little jittery for a little while or a bit on edge. Let me give you one, maybe you can understand this. You're zipping down the road because you're busy, right? Maybe we'll even say Hanstown Road, which we all know is what speed limit? Exactly. 35. It is 35, okay? But it's driven like it's 75. But you're busy, right? You're zipping, zipping, zipping. Well, if you didn't know, in this lower lot of ours, there are sometimes some police officers that like to hang out. So you're zipping by at the speed limit, and you see flashing lights from our parking lot. What do you feel? Right? Right there in the chest. It might sink to your stomach a little bit. Your eyes go wide. You're ready. You know what? You have just hit the limbic system, the fire alarm, fight, flight, or freeze. Am I running? Am I fighting him? Or am I actually stopping? Right? That's what happens. But now let's say he zips by and pulls over the person in front of you who was really speeding, right? Right? Do you know what happens on the other side of that? But do you know what remains? There's that little kind of like the vestiges of what happened, and that will soon fade. Imagine what it's like if you don't get to that, but you're constantly on the stressed, not sure what's going to happen, danger, what do I do? When you're constantly in that, or you're in it, out it, in it, out of it, in it, out of it, what that does to you internally, and what begins to flow out of that. I want to suggest then that unhealed trauma traps us in cycles of darkness, where there's times where we feel like we're coming out before being pulled back down. And again, this is not a you either are or you aren't. There's different spectrums of this, different degrees of it, different severities. But for this, I think we can either gain clarity into understanding others and where they're at and providing the help, hope, and healing that Jesus offers, but maybe we're also able to bring it into ourselves and ask for the right kind of hope. If in these unhealed cycles that we're in, the unhealed trauma producing these cycles, I want to say it again, the hope is not to just buck up and handle it. Just suck it up. That is not the hope. That is not what's going to move you forward. Pastor Dan Gregory said this in his message when he was talking about it. He says, I can walk through the stages of my trauma and my pain into the light of his hope. And that is for me, that's kind of a hinge point. You don't get over trauma. Did you hear me? You don't get over trauma. Well, I'm done with that. It's in the past. It's no big deal. You walk through it. And yes, you remember it. Yes, it affects you, but it does not define you. But it will always be a part of you. So what does it look like to shine light on our trauma? For each of these, we've looked at what does it look like to shine light into these things? Well, remember Daniel 2:22, which we talked about last week, says that God reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. So let's look at some of the stages, and I'm going to have to move rapid fire. Okay? So if you need to, if you miss some stuff, go back and listen to it online and slow it down like to 50%. But we have to get through this. But it's important, do not skip a stage in this trauma, in these stages of trauma, but don't get stuck in one either. It's very tempting to do either of those, but don't skip it and don't get stuck in it. Now, this is just kind of my assessment of this. Some people say there's 3 stages of trauma. Some people say 4 or 5 or 6 or even 7 stages. I'm just looking at the paradigm of 4. But I think it will be helpful. First of all, as we're shining light on trauma, we need to recognize that shock is expected. This is that fight, flight, or freeze response where we're kind of sometimes even dazed. This is what happens when you're in trauma or when you're re-experiencing trauma through those things called triggers. It's an ongoing thing, and we should expect shock to set in. Have you ever seen somebody who's in shock? I know a lot of my military friends, police, and first responder friends have said that they have, and it's amazing, the change that will overcome a person when they're in the middle of trauma. If you're familiar with Ecclesiastes 4, again, if you're one of those church people, talks about that 2 are better than 1 because they have good reward for their toil. It goes on and says, if 2 lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. The whole idea is when you try to do it yourself, you're unlikely to succeed. We're not designed to do it on our own, and particularly when there are problems, when there are issues. Maybe me is not the right voice to listen to in the middle of trauma. We're tempted because we do these self-talks about how terrible it is and I'm never going to get over and this. I mean, you guys, a lot of you know that my wife had a knee injury and she's able to actually start moving around now. It's really exciting. But every now and again, she says, tell me this is not how it's always going to be. Tell me I'm actually going to be able to move again, right? Because it's so easy to tell yourself, this is just how it's going to be. I'm never going to walk again. And my kids are going to always be faster than me. Well, they probably will. You've met our kids. They're going to be faster than anyone in here. But it's so easy to get lost in you need the voice of someone else. When you are in trauma, don't rely on yourself to walk through it. That is a recipe for disaster. But it's also not a time to run from God or from others. In fact, it's a time to let them run to you. If you're in trauma, let God run to you. Because that's what the Bible talks about, that God pursues us in our pain and in our brokenness. Especially God's people. I can't speak for those who have chosen not to follow Jesus, but I know if someone who has legitimately chosen to follow Jesus, they want to bring help and hope into your life. They want to bring healing into your life because they've experienced it from Jesus. Let the community of God's people bring that into your life. Let them run to you. Now, if you're trying to help someone in the States, let me give you a couple words of advice. Okay? Don't underestimate the power of presence. So often we try to figure out words. Let me give you for example. Everybody thinks that when someone's in chaos or trouble or pain, they go, I don't know what to do. Somebody call the pastor and send him, right? He's a pastor. He knows what to do. Have any of you thought that? You better put some hands up because I know you do it. Yeah, you're liars. Okay. Yeah, my wife has. I got to tell you, when I'm sitting there with somebody who's in trauma, I don't know what to say. It stinks. It's horrible. But sometimes, I've learned this most of the time, just sitting with them is the most powerful thing you can do. Don't underestimate the power of your presence and learn to embrace the awkward. There is no right thing to say. Don't try to throw, quippish little Christian cliches at people. It's going to be awkward. You're not going to know what to say. They're not going to know what to say. Your presence is the power. And remember, this is not the time to correct either logic or theology. Okay? I remember early on in my zeal for the ministry, tried to always have that right theology. Remember people saying, well, my grandmother just died. Well, heaven gained another angel. Well, you know what I said? No. People don't become angels. They ascend to the presence of Jesus. They're with him. But people never become angels. Just make sure you understand that. How comforting and kind and compassionate was that? Yeah. Now, it wasn't that I was inaccurate. I do believe that. I believe the Bible teaches that angels and human beings are distinctly separate entities. People do not become angels, but that person doesn't need to hear at that moment I don't need to correct their theology or their logic, but we'll often try to do that. And just make sure that people feel safe and they feel your presence. Okay? What they need more than you saying, I'll pray for you, is actually just pray for them. I pray for you right now. What they need more than you fixing all their issues is to literally just sit beside them. Well, the next step I would say this is to release your feelings. You have to recognize shock is expected, then you have to release your feelings. And we all do this differently. Stop thinking that everybody has to do it your way. The number of times I've sat with couples and in particular, usually, in my experience, it's been the wife would say something to the effect of, my husband is so unemotional. Sometimes that could be true, but often it was she just didn't recognize that he was expressing all kinds of emotion, just doing it differently than her. Okay? Now, we do need to express those emotions. We need to release them, but we have to stop coming up with this weird standard that yours has to look like mine. But the truth of the matter is this: we must process our feelings. We have to, because if we don't deal with our emotions, they will deal with us. Okay? There is a danger when you preach. Were you aware of that? I know some of you in this room have preached before, but there's a danger when you preach, because usually what you preach on, the Lord squishes you on first. Were you aware of that? Man, I got squished this week. And I'm being straight honest, a little transparent with you guys. This was a hard week. I found out that there were some traumas in my life, some things that had little woundings that had happened, but never really processed, didn't really deal with. I kind of knew they were back there, but I didn't realize how much I was letting them define me. And I responded with some terrible anger towards my wife. I mean, we're okay. You can check with her. She's safe. I will not interfere. Feel free to check with her. We're in a good place. But I mean, I just blew my stack. And one of the reasons I knew that I was incredibly disproportionate in my response was because she actually became quiet and just stood back a little bit. Kind of gave me that look, you know? And it really caused me to stop, pause, and start digging into, why did I respond that way? This is coming out of nowhere. This doesn't make sense. I look back and there was some things about feeling not heard or not valued or not okay in my skin kind of stuff from younger years of my life that never really got healed. They didn't really shine the kind of light on it that they needed to. And my wife, years and years after that trauma, it fell on her. Now, I never had any massive, significant trauma, but I'm recognizing the thing, that developmental, that complex trauma, is described this way. It's like if you have a backpack, okay? Now, if you have a significant trauma, it's like trying to stick a big boulder in the backpack and carry it in there, right? But this complex trauma, which I think a lot more of us deal with, it's like dropping a pebble in. If you drop a pebble or two in, it's no big deal. But if over the course of a few years, every couple of days, somebody drops another pebble in, what happens after the course of a few years? You're crushed by the weight of that backpack. It's all little stones, it's all little things, but all of them massing together. And that's what I was starting to walk through and do. Man, I got a lot of pebbles in this backpack that I got to let out. We need to release these things. We need to deal with those. And when we do, this is where sorrow happens. This is the stage where you really get kind of sad. But God's okay with that, and God can handle that. Psalm 56, verse 8 says this: speaking of God, you have kept count of my tossings and put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? God is right there with us as we begin to recognize this in ourselves or even in others, and we process with them. And God captures every tear, every bit of sorrow God cares about. He keeps record of, and he walks with you. Isaiah 53 tells us that Jesus himself was a man of sorrows, that he was acquainted with suffering. Jesus knows, God knows what it means to suffer. Well, how do we release our feelings? There's lots of different ways, but I want to suggest two quick ones. And that is, first of all, write them out to God and worship. Say that you're still God, even in light of this. And I can say that because, and we'll talk about this a little bit more next week. Worship is really worship when I don't feel like worshiping. Were you aware of that? That's when worship really kicks out. It's when I'm not emotionally just driven and ecstatic about it, but I recognize your worth even in the midst of the storm. I recognize your goodness even in the midst of the storm, and I will worship. So I would suggest you write them out, not because God needs you to know, but there's a process that happens in us when we put them down, pen to paper, to make them real and put them out there. And once you do that, the second step I would suggest is you share them with a friend. Find someone safe to share them with. And if you don't have anyone safe in your life to share them with, please talk to me before you leave. Drop a comment online and let us know, and we will connect you with someone that will be safe and be present with you. But that's, I think, two ways that you can begin to release these feelings. The first will build your intimacy with God. The second will build your intimacy with others. And that intimacy will create a environment for healing to begin to take place. And this is also the stage where you begin to ask why, right? The stage before, you're just kind of in it, in that shock and the feeling of the actual thing that's going on. This is where you get to why. Why God? And if you're like me, when you were young, you were kind of taught from the church, if you were part of the church when you were younger, that you don't ask why. Don't be a doubting Thomas. Except I don't know why we did that, because if you look at it, Jesus never condemned him. He actually gave him exactly what he was looking for. He answered his why. And all throughout the Bible, this question of why is asked. If you look in Jeremiah, the prophet asks why all over the place. In Habakkuk, the prophet there says, "How long, O Lord? Why is this going on?" The why question is asked. Jesus himself quotes a psalm and says to God on the cross, "Why have you forsaken me?" The question of why is all through. The Bible is full of it, and why is not the problem. Gotcha. Asking the question why is not the problem. I need to wrestle with or into God and not away from him. There's a difference of why, of who are you to, and why of help me understand. What we need to do is take that why and move it to help me understand. Because I believe there are answers, not complete answers, not total answers. Why did this person die? Why did I get this diagnosis? We're never going to get full answers, but we get glimpses of them. And let me suggest that we can't be afraid of those who are wrestling with God or others in this stage. We need to let people release these feelings. And again, I'm going to have to rapid fire. The next is reorient my thinking. Once I walk through these two of recognizing and releasing, now I have to reorient my thinking. This is where I start replacing what's going on in here with a better assessment. We need new perspectives, and this is where you gain them. And it's not just new. We need to move from what might be my clouded perception to a right perception. Because what often happens when I'm releasing my feelings is that I let them keep releasing, and I get into that cycle. All right, how many of you know about cows? Anybody? Cows. Okay, a few of you know about cows. You know how cows eat? Are you aware of this? They chew some food, like most, mammals, and then they do what with it? They swallow it. Now, unlike, let's say, humans, do you know what they do next? They regurgitate it back into their mouth and chew on it again. And then swallow it. And then you're getting the picture. It's this ongoing of chew, swallow, sort of digest, puke back into your mouth, repeat the process. Okay, now it works for them in their digestion, but guess what? You know what that doesn't work for? Reliving our trauma. When we're letting our minds just ruminate over and over and over and over and never reorient, that's where we get to this ongoing cycle. And these things of trauma, they often lay sidewalks in our brain, ways we're supposed to walk, directions we're supposed to go, and we get used to walking them, and we kind of develop ruts. What we need to do during this stage is find new pathways to walk, new ways to think about things. And this is where hopefully we can get to the point where we can actually trust God to be better at bringing about justice than me. Because in this is where it's hard. Like, this was not right that this happened to me. And I want to get justice. And often we can't. We cannot get justice for ourselves. But are we able to trust that the good, great, glorious, gracious God above is a God of justice and will in some way, at the end of all things, set things right? That's, if we can reorient our brains there, that's where I think we start to have freedom. And now, as we're reorienting, finding new ways of thinking, the last stage is this: to repurpose my pain. And please, let me give you a warning. Do not try to skip to this before you walk through the previous ones. This is like somebody who just found out that their child died and said, "Oh, don't worry, God can turn this into good." Do you know what that feels like to the parent that just lost a child? It is re-traumatizing all over. You might be trying to help them repurpose it, but this is not, you don't move to this until you've walked through these other stages. But I want to say this is where the real healing happens. It's the work of the previous stages, walking through them. Again, not just bucking it up, or, buck up and take it, but actually walking through it. This is where healing happens. I can't rush or skip those previous stages. And I need, at this point, this is where I make the decision. It's where I make that decision for myself, that my pain will be my school and not my prison. Too often I let it define who I am rather than inform what I will do. Now, I can't let myself be defined by my pain or my trauma, whether for good or bad, because I am defined by who God says I am, by who I'm created to be, by my undeniable worth as an image bearer of God. Romans 8. I encourage you to read it. We don't have time to go through it all, but I want to suggest this. He says in Romans 8, again, the Apostle Paul, verse 18, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. And then he goes on to talk about how no matter what's happening, sword or famine or death or plague or all these things, nothing can separate us from God's love because of Jesus. Nothing. Now, it feels like everything can separate us sometimes. When our worlds are falling apart, it feels like so much can separate us. But the truth is, where I repurpose my pain is when I can hold on to that truth, when I can say, I know that God is with me in this. Now, one last verse to share with you. It's actually a couple verses that came before the ones from 2 Corinthians that we shared before. I think this answers the why. So what does this repurposing mean? Well, look what he says here, verse 3 of chapter 1. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies, the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction, with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. This is taking the burnt dead ashes and seeing new life emerge. In the midst of the pain and the suffering, you don't skip here. You got to walk through this. But when you do, you can take what the enemy wants to use for evil, what sin has broken, and see it reformed into something beautiful as you help and serve others and bring comfort into dark places, where you shine light into the dark places, because the only way to dispel the darkness is to let the light in. Now, for each of us, there's going to be different ways when we deal with our trauma. I beg and urge you, if you're in a place where you're feeling trauma, you're feeling the effects of trauma, the triggers that sometimes can make you relive trauma, don't try to do it alone. That is one of the scariest things. And let me, just like we said with Ecclesiastes, you're probably not the best person to listen to if you're in the middle of trauma. Let others bring voice in. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, we need to recognize that shock is expected, so we need to be willing to sit with people. Do you know the Jewish practice, sitting Shiva? Have you heard that? Sitting Shiva? It's actually from the Jewish word Shiva, from Shiva, which means 7, because there's a Jewish practice that when someone loses a close relative, you go and you sit with them for a week and just sit with them. Provide comfort, just be there. And this actually traces back to the book of Job. You guys familiar with the book of Job? Job had all these horrible things happen, and after all these horrible things happen, he has a bunch of friends who come over and sit with him, right? And it says that they sat with him for 7 days and 7 nights. And that was the only thing these guys got right. Okay, because after that, they gave all their great ideas, and they were terrible and wrong, and God was like, I'm going to smack you dead for that. Like he was not happy with them, but they sat with him, and that's what we can do. Who in your life needs to be sat with? Are you in a place where you need to sit with someone? Don't put the walls up if you're in that place. Ask for help. But we also need to release our feelings. I already kind of gave you some ideas. I encourage you this week, for those things that maybe are deep inside, those deep places we talked about last week, I think it's time to write them out. Write them out to God and share them with someone. Real tangible step you can do this week. We need to reorient our thinking. Sometimes that means we recognize the dangerous pathways that are up here. And it's usually the ones that are really well worn, right? Make sense? The things that you constantly say to yourself over and over and over again that quite frankly aren't all that helpful. There are dangerous pathways that maybe I've developed or others have developed in my head, and say, how do I get off that path? And usually you need someone's help. You're not going to be able to just reason it out on your own. You're going to need to identify and say, can you help me think about this differently? And then the last is when we repurpose our pain. I don't know where you're at, but I want to give you an example. And I ask permission here. If you don't know Gwen Gwen's over in the corner. She's trying to hide from me because I told her I was going to talk about this. A number of years ago now, Gwen lost her husband. And that is a traumatic event. It just is. And yet, as she's walked through it, and you ask her now, she's in the process of walking through that. She says, I want to help others who are in the same place. So for the last 6 months or so, she's been running a widows group on a monthly basis to allow people to come together and share and find comfort. And in the next several months, it looks like we're going to tweak it a little bit and make it a grief group, kind of open to anybody who's in a place of grief. And what do we do to process grief? Gwen is trying to repurpose her pain. She's not saying her pain is good, but she's saying there can be goodness and glory on the other side of it because of what Jesus brings. That's what it means. How can you repurpose your pain? The loss, the grief, the pain that you're feeling, how can you repurpose that? Now, believe it or not, I know I've gone long. I actually have a whole bunch more content, but we're going to stop there. This is a big topic, and I hope you keep talking about it in your life groups and other places. But what I'd like us to do right now is take just a moment, and we're going to pray. The worship team's going to be coming up. We're going to sing a song that's been our anthem for this series, that we speak the name of Jesus, okay? We're going to sing that. I encourage you to sing it out loud because the power of Jesus' name can make all the difference. But if you will, join me in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you that you love us. We thank you that in the midst of the ugliness and the brokenness that we find in this world, that you know the pain, you know the brokenness, and you stand with us. God, we don't know how to bring light to all the dark corners, but we know that you do. You tell us that you are the light and you know the darkness. So God, help shine light into our dark places. And God, I want to pray for anyone here now who is in the midst of trauma, who is feeling the pain, who is feeling the ongoing grief that accompanies it. God, I ask for your healing and your release. I pray for your comfort and I pray for your peace. And God, I pray for that, knowing that ultimately the true answer that you've revealed to us in your word to finding the real hope is to be restored and set new by you. So if anyone here, Father, has not turned and learned to trust Jesus with everything they've got, I pray that you convict those hearts now. Pray that they say yes to you, yes to your Son, and cross from death into life. And for those of us who have, God, help us to remember what it means to follow after Jesus. And God, shine light into our dark places. Thank you that you care more about us than we could ever understand. We pray this all in the name of Jesus. Amen.